Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 267, The Showman. Part 1. Patrick John Daly had a string of horse stealing charges in the early 1900s in several states of Australia. He was also a showman. Patrick was born on the 25th of November 1870 at Indigo Creek near Barnawartha in Victoria to Patrick Daly and Helena O'Leary, known as Ellen, who are both Irish. The earliest account I can see in the newspapers of John Patrick Daly is actually under the name of P.H Montogomery, and it seems that he travelled with Harmston's American Circus and Wild West Show. They featured in Broken Hill in July 1890, when he would have been 20 years old, then went on to Newcastle in January 1891, as well as to Maitland. By September 1894, he's travelling with Abel and Claire's Circus that ran a show in Sydney, where it mentions that Mr. P.H Montogomery was excellent, doubling up with Miss Vernon in a double bareback ride. He remains with Abel and Claire's Circus until October 1894. Then they moved to Burton's National Circus that travels to Tasmania. On the 21st of January 1895, so when he would have been 25 years old, it says the horsemanship feats of Mr. P. Montogomery were much applauded. Cassie, the trick horse, was amenable to the voice of the instructor, Mr. P.H Montogomery, who found no difficulty in getting the animal to do whatever he liked. Another article at the time said that Mr. P.H Montogomery was an old favourite with Tasmanians, so it seems to me that he started off quite early in the circus world with his horsemanship skills. In May 1895, he must have left Burton Circus in Tasmania and went up to Sydney to work for the Pacific Circus for a short while, but then he's returned to Tasmania. He's still in Tasmania in January 1898, and then by February 1898, it looks like he is back with Harmston's Great Circus, where it said he introduced his mare Nellie, who gave a display of intelligence that must be seen to be fully realised and appreciated. There is also an Annie Montgomery that's listed at this time, and she's also displaying her skills of horsemanship. Then by May 1890, he's over in South Australia with Harmston's Circus, and it says Mr. P.H Montogomery succeeded in accomplishing his bounding trick of springing from the ground into a standing posture on the horse's back. By the 27th of December 1901 in South Australia, he's moved across to Fitzgerald Circus, where it says Mr. P.H Montogomery himself is an old favourite of the ring. The performance, under the command of Mr. Montgomery, was an excellent one, the animals being endowed with almost human intelligence. And Katie Montgomery followed him into Fitzgerald Circus. We see him still known as Montgomery, but now he's styling himself as Professor Montgomery. And while being with Fitzgerald Circus, he also is doing a little bit of a sideshow that he's managing and doing himself. And it said he gave an exhibition of scientific horsebreaking in the yard of the Apollo Bay Hotel on New Year's Day. And this was published on the 7th of January 1902 in the Colac Herald. A large crowd assembled to see the professor and were highly delighted and greatly instructed by the performance. The professor's methods of roping and handling young colts was greatly admired. The professor was very soon riding a young unhandled filly round the yard without a saddle or bridle. He had a saddle handed to him whilst on the animal's back, which he slipped under and girthed up while the filly was carrying him around. He then got the bridle and put it on. The professor is a real expert and is anxious to teach and instruct all who handle horses. He's to conduct a class next week and give a week's instruction. Already 40 have enrolled their names as desirous of joining the class. And then on the 13th of February 1902 he's down at Gippsland at Curramborough. Horse taming extraordinary. Professor Montgomery will give one of his very clever exhibitions in riding and general horse management in the yards at Curramborough on the 14th of February. People owning unbroken and unruly horses are requested to bring them in. The professor intends staying in the locality for some time and is forming a class for instruction in horsemanship. On the 15th of March 1902 in the Beechworth Ovens and Murray Advertiser, a man calling himself Professor Montgomery, who's been attending various shows throughout Gippsland giving exhibitions of horse taming, has been arrested by the police at Delegate, New South Wales, on 2 warrants issued by the Corumburra bench, charging him with obtaining money under false pretences from people under the pretence that he would give them lessons in taming the noble animal, the horse, and another charge of stealing a saddle. The police have reason to believe that the professor is identical with a well-known and long-sought-for criminal named John Daly, who's been wanted by the police of South Australia for larceny and escaping from custody, and by the New South Wales police for false pretences, horse stealing and escaping from custody. The circumstances of his last escape are interesting. Constable Glennon of Lockhart got trace of Daly in 1899, of whom he was in search on several charges of horse stealing at Glen Wills, Bethanga and Chiltern. The constable tied his horse up at a hotel and went in to look for Daly. Daly was there but made his way out and jumped on the policeman's horse and galloped away. The constable, however, commandeered another horse which was handy, and after a 20-mile chase succeeded in overtaking Daly and arrested him. Then Daly feigned madness and was remanded to the Kenmore Lunatic Asylum, from which, as might be anticipated, he made his escape over the wall. So at this stage, it's looking like John Patrick Daly had to get out very quickly. So we now find him not only in a completely different colony, but with a completely different name. In the Rockhampton Daily Record on the 11th of April 1903 in Emerald, it says that on Saturday, Mr W.G. Kemp gave a very entertaining exhibition of horsemanship at Mr Locke's yards in the presence of 200 people, including a number of ladies. Mr Kemp has any amount of courage, and the way he handled and rode the outlaws was proof that he is a thoroughly capable man amongst horses. A couple of months later, in Rockhampton on the 20th of June 1903, he's now known as Professor Kemp. The horse expert, Mr W.G. Kemp, gave some exhibitions of his skill in his hippodrome on the showground yesterday, and a number of feats performed were highly praised by competent judges. The professor will show again today, and during the afternoon he'll give a benefit in aid of the local hospital, in which the Governor, Major General Sir Herbert Chermside, and Lady Chermside will be present. Some difficult horses and bullocks have been kept specially for this exhibition. And a little pamphlet's just been published on the subject by Mr W.G. Kemp, titled The Breaker, which will be read with much interest. Mr Kemp's given instructions in a clear and concise manner, and as the booklet is sold at a nominal price, it should secure a ready sale. And still in Queensland, at Charters Towers on the 27th of July 1903, there was another good attendance at the Cremorne Gardens on Saturday night when some splendid demonstrations in horse training were given by Professor Kemp, who handles the animals in a marvellous manner. Professor Kemp is a horseman who has no rival, and to see him riding buck jumpers with a bridle makes people hold their breath with astonishment. This famous horse trainer has a book in circulation, a practical booklet on the taming, training and education of the Australian horse, and it gives an idea of Professor Kemp's humane treatment. He adds in the preface, "If I may be the means of benefiting and saving from cruelty only one of these noble animals, then I shall feel I am amply repaid. This book is well worth perusal. There'll be no exhibition tonight owing to the indisposition of Professor Kemp. Persons have unruly horses are requested to send them in tomorrow night for the hospital benefit." And a week later in the Charters Towers Mining Standard on the 5th of August 1903, a wages case. This morning at the police court, James Woolford sued Professor Kemp for £1 for wages alleged to be due for work done. James Woodford stated he went over to Kemp's show on the 17th of July and saw Sullivan, the defendant's manager, there. Sullivan engaged the witness to see that people could not get over the fence. He worked from the 17th to the 25th of July, and on the 26th, being a hospital benefit, gave his services free. For the defence, Walter Kemp, alias Professor Kemp, stated that with regard to plaintiff's claim he knew nothing about it. Sullivan asked the witness if he could come and see the show and was told he was welcome to come and learn what was doing, and if he could be of any assistance the witness would be obliged. The only man the witness employed was a man named Dick. When the witness received the summons in Ravenswood, he thought it was from Dick. The witness did not know the complainant at all, never spoke to him about looking after the fence. In rebuttal, William Guy, the sheriff's bailiff, stated he knew the parties and he was present at the defendant's show. He saw the plaintiff there. The plaintiff was keeping the lads from getting over the fence. He heard Kemp tell Woolford to keep the lads from getting over the corner at Gill Street. After hearing Mr. Boyce, the bench dismissed the case. On the 23rd of September 1903, the Wild River Times at Herberton in Queensland, Kemp's Buck Jumpers. This troupe of equestrian performers opened for a short season in Herberton on Wednesday and Saturday evenings last and were fairly well patronised. The professor himself, the most wonderful horseman of the day, proved himself no novice amongst horseflesh. Professor Kemp undertakes to break in any horses to the satisfaction of owners, either to saddle or harness. We understand that he and his men are now employed upon breaking in a number of horses for certain residents at the Deep Lead. The only lady buck jumper in Australia, Miss Marigold, also performs in the ring, dressed in the regulation costume of the breaker. And the advertisement for this show, in Herberton, buck jumping and the art of horsemanship. Professor Kemp, the most wonderful horseman of the day. Owners are requested to bring in their unbroken or unruly horses when they will be treated by the professor in the usual able manner. A plentiful supply of bullocks, bulls and horses will be in attendance. The only lady buckjumper rider in Australia, Miss Marigold, will ride without a bridle any buckjumper brought in. The wonderful Georgia Magnet also performs her wonderful feats, the only performance of its kind in the world. John Patrick Daly is listed under Walter Gerald Kemp in the division of Capricornia in the 1903 census as living at Carnarvon Lagoons, and his occupation is a horsebreaker. And then in June 1904 in Herberton at the Atherton Show, buck jumping and horse breaking on the grounds. Professor Kemp, the breaker of the day, will show on the grounds at Atherton during the show days. Special attraction, Madam Kemp in her wonderful feats of horsemanship with Miss Marigold, the magnetic wonder. Don't forget to visit the show. This is the first time we see a reference to Miss Kemp, and you will notice in further articles and advertisements that it alternates from Miss Kemp referring to his sister, Miss Kemp referring to his daughter, but then there's also clearly stated too that Miss Kemp is actually Mrs. Kemp, and she's also referred to as Mrs. Daly. I cannot find a formal marriage record for John Patrick Daly marrying before or around this time. In Townsville on the 5th of December 1904, in the North Queensland Register, Professor Kemp. Professor Kemp has been in Geraldton for 2 months or so, and he intends to make for Herbert River en route to Charters Towers very soon, and I'm giving my impressions of his work among horses. Putting the matter shortly, Kemp is the only genius of horse mastery I've ever known. His handling of the young unbroken horses comes as a revelation and a relief to those who desire to know the best methods of breaking. The first lesson you can give a horse is the most important, says Kemp. All will agree with this, but what shall their lesson be, we may well ask. I will not anticipate, as you will have the opportunity of seeing the man and his methods very soon. All I can say is that I'm dreadfully sorry to see him leave us. A perfect prince of horsemen, physically and intellectually, he commands admiration, but genius alone describes his power. His methods are straightforward, and those who wish to learn will find an enthusiastic and friendly helper in Professor Kemp, and his patience, even with triflers, is simply wonderful. That this man is a perfect horsemaster is apparent in every department. He has a true eye for a horse naturally, and by long experience, guided by passionate love of horses, he has gathered knowledge. He's worked with veterinary surgeons and racing men, including James Scobie. He's been taught by the very best master Europe can boast, Major Pitzka, who was commissioned to travel the whole world to investigate and report upon the horsework of different nations. Major Pitzka and Professor Kemp fortunately met and spent many months together in mutual admiration of each other's particular power. You will see horses trained by the secret Belgian process. Do not ask Kemp, for he cannot divulge the secret of this work, and take my advice and do not try to find out. For centuries, the Belgian government have guarded certain methods of training horses. Many of these secret processes are known to Kemp, Major Pitzka, and Major Pitzka declared that Kemp's own methods of handling horses are unequalled anywhere. I have seen Arab horsemen and their feats of moving about the saddle at full gallop to shoot behind them, which always struck me as unsurpassed, but Kemp can do them all and more. In breaking to harness, Kemp is equally happy in his methods. Everywhere, headwork is to be seen, effective and sound, and results show swift manipulation. Professor Kemp has a little beauty called Chester. In fact, so intelligent is he will kneel and lie down at word of command, tell the time, and answer yea or no by a nod or shake of his head. He has been taught the Morse code and can send any telegraphic message within reason, in a way any telegraph master can read and dispatch.
Chester can beat most school children at mental arithmetic, and nothing he enjoys better than a visit to the schools and pitting his wits against the children. He can count the number of heads in the show tent and often can tell if anyone slips in without a ticket. Now, in conclusion, I recommend everyone to seriously consider Professor Kemp's methods, and if the people will only provide him with plenty of unbroken animals, they will never tire of watching him at work. The rougher parts of the professor's show work, buck jumping and bullock riding, although popular and extremely able, do not appeal to me as much as the finishing handling of young horses. At the same time, Professor Kemp can and will back himself against any rider in Queensland or elsewhere, and Madam Kemp will hold her own with most men in the art of sitting buck jumpers. So 3 weeks later, the announcement of Kemp's monster buck jumping show in Charters Towers. On the ground opposite the Waterboard office in Mary Street, buck jumping, riding, handling unbroken colts and the talking horse Chester, with Miss Marigold in wonderful magnetic feats. A draft of local horses will be operated on, prizes offered for successful riders on some of the show horses, and the greatest attraction of all, Madam Kemp, the only lady buck jumper in the world. Madam Kemp will ride any local buck jumping outlaws brought to the show. And the Charters Towers Northern Miner the next day outlined the show. Professor Kemp opened last night at the old circus grounds in Mary Street and was greeted with a good attendance, which greatly appreciated the excellent program presented, much of the professor's work being decidedly original. His handling and taming of horses at once showing him a past master at the game and in a class of himself. He kept his audience fully interested while at work, and his remarks on the correct methods of horse breaking seemed to meet with general approval. The program opened with the pony Chester, a handsome and well-trained animal, telling the time by the post office clock, and the day of the week, and a jump event between Chester and a foal was also attractive. The professor then gave an exhibition of his methods of handling and training a horse, the animal he operated on being an aged dark grey of Walter Chicks, bad-tempered and with a reputation of having bested all the local breakers who've tackled him. He's handy with his teeth. He bit twice at the professor and once nipped him on the arm. While handling this horse, which was reduced to such a state of submission that even the knocker line could not make him buck, the professor had a bad spill through receiving a blow on the head, and the mane giving away in his grasp while he was holding the horse, in consequence of a sudden and powerful swerve. He landed on the back of his head and was counted out for 3 minutes. He then went on working the horse, the audience applauding him vigorously, but he complained of dizziness for the rest of the evening, and it interfered somewhat with his work. A song by Madam Kemp took on well, and a recitation, Texas Jack, by the professor was so much to the taste of the audience that complaints were loud when he came to a full stop in the middle of the poem. His exhibition of dismounting from an untrustworthy horse, with an absolute certainty of saving both saddle and bridle, was very valuable. And another advertisement on Christmas Eve in Charters Towers, Kemp's Monster Buck Jumping Show, great success, opening again tonight. Horsemen, come and see the professor in his marvellous handling of vicious horses. Owners are requested to bring along anything unruly. The marvellous ride, the professor on bulls and bullocks, special yards for the occasion. Greatest attraction of all, Madam Kemp, the only lady buck jumper in the world, any local horse you like, and Miss Marigold in a wonderful magnetic feat. Come one, come all. On Monday night, the professor gave a demonstration of his methods with dealing with horses, completely surprising a lively filly from Burdekin Downs. The show concluded with an exciting ride by Madam Kemp on a chestnut with a black boy behind the saddle, and she rode the horse to a standstill. The professor reopens tonight. The main attraction expected is the bullock riding. There should be a good attendance. It then announced that he had moved from Rockhampton to Townsville, and it says the professor is now married. And speaking of the professor's entertainment, the Townsville Bulletin goes on to say that Mr. Kemp gave an effective display of rough riding on locally obtained horses, and Mrs. Kemp gave an effective display of rough riding on a locally obtained horse, which she sat and handled splendidly. When the horse had got over the worst of his temper, Mrs. Kemp invited the audience to take a seat behind her, double banking the horse. Madam also performed feats such as the human bridge, lying with her head on one chair and heels on another, allowing 2 12-stone men to walk on her. She also resisted the efforts of several men to lift her off her feet. At this time, the Miss Kemp or Madam Kemp or Mrs. Kemp, it doesn't seem that she was actually related to Jack Daly. It could have been on his part a way to advertise more of a family-friendly show. I have reason to believe that Miss Kemp was actually Jessie Hickman, née Hunt, who I did an episode on, episode 34. Jessie joined Martini and Shaw's circus. Martini and his de facto New Zealand-born partner Julia, known as Jewel or Jessie Devine as stage names, cared for Jessie after they took her in with them when they left the Scunthorpe show in 1901. Jessie was a horse worker in Martini's buck jumping show and she thrived, and at the age of 14 in 1905 and in 1906, under the name of Miss Kemp, she was Australian Ladies Rough Riding Champion. So again in late December in Charters Towers, Kemp's Rough Riding Show opened to a fair audience tonight. The professor put Chester through some very difficult headwork for which he received rounds of applause. With Madam Kemp having favoured the audience with a song, she mounted a big bay without a bridle. The bay bucked around the ring a couple of times without disturbing the lady, who wore a smile the whole time, but probably owing to a pull on the knocker line, the horse came down partly under the rails, Madam Kemp and Toby being held under the horse's weight. They were released as quickly as possible, with Toby being none the worse, but the lady equestrian was unable to stand and shortly afterwards fainted. She was removed to her hotel where she received medical attendance, and Professor Kemp made the welcome announcement that the injury was not serious, but one of the small bones of her foot were broken, which would necessitate her for resting for some weeks. So it seems there was a little bit of a break. And then in Charters Towers on the 10th of January 1905, it announces that at Cremorne Gardens tonight, Kemp's buck jumping and variety combination reopens, with Madam Kemp reappearing in her wonderful bucking act. The Zinger family are to perform their thrilling Japanese ladder feat, Rollo, the king of jugglers, in his marvellous feats of sword-swallowing, fire-eating and other thrilling acts. The professor will appear in new roles as a horseman, and the performance is to conclude with a Bungaree steeplechase. So it seems while the show was laid up for a little while, he's gathered extra performers and is more really doing a combination of a buck jumping show and a circus at this time. On the 7th of February 1905 in Charters Towers, he appears in the court as Walter Gerald Kemp. Walter Gerald Kemp on bail for disorderly conduct failed to answer his name and his bail was estreated. Then Annie Mueller proceeded against Walter Gerald Kemp for assault. Annie Mueller was the barmaid at the Courthouse Hotel, and she said that on Sunday night that the defendant came into the hotel between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, and as she was leaving the bar, the defendant struck her on the face with his open hand. She gave him no provocation. Miss Evans was present when he assaulted her. She did not know the name of the man he was with. When she refused the sixpence from him, the defendant slapped her in the face. He had a drink last week but did not pay for it. She did not see any other money in his hand. Winnie Evans gave evidence that she saw the defendant strike Annie Mueller with an open hand on the chin. She did not give defendant any provocation. She saw him offer to pay the complainant the sixpence, but when she went to take it he refused to give it and struck her in the face. He then threw the sixpence in her face. The witness was standing just outside the bar. Walter Gerald Kemp gave evidence that one morning last week he called into the Courthouse Hotel and asked the complainant for a drink. He told her he had no money and she said, "We don't book drinks." He replied when he had money he would pay her. At 7:30 on Sunday night he went into the Court Hotel with another man. When they had the drink, the man with him said, "I am not going to pay for them now." Mrs. Lewis was there and the defendant told her if the man did not pay for the drinks he would. Witness had a sovereign in his hand and offered to pay for the drinks, and the complainant asked him to pay the sixpence he owed. He put his hand in his pocket and took it out. The complainant had come from behind the bar and was walking away. He had the sixpence in his hand and reacted it out to her, saying, "Here is the sixpence." She struck his hand and knocked the sovereign and the sixpence out of his hand. She then called out for Mr. Lewis. He caught Witness and said, "Come on, Kemp." Witness said, "I'm not going out till I get this money." Mr. Lewis insisted on his going out. The defendant was fined £3 and 1 costs of the court in default of 14 days in the lockup. Then there's nothing of the show until the 19th of August 1905, when it's being advertised in the Port Denison Times and Bowen Advocate. Professor Kemp, the celebrated horsemaster, will open a monster Wild West show this evening at Proserpine. Owners of outlaw buck jumpers and strong unbroken colts are invited, produce them, upon which clever and daring feats too numerous to mention will be performed by Professor and Madam Kemp and others of the troop of Rough Riders. The Talking Horse Chester will perform. And in the Mackay Mercury on the 14th of December 1905, buck jumping. Last evening, a huge tent erected by Professor Kemp at the vacant allotment next to Appelt and Maclean's was filled with a big audience, the occasion being a benefit performance in the aid of the hospital. Professor Kemp, the hardy horseman, mounted and rode 5 unbroken colts bareback inside 3 minutes. The calculating horse Chester provided great amusement. Professor Kemp gave a first-class exhibition of rough riding both on bullocks and horses. The professor's powers of control over unbroken horses were considered to be marvellous by expert horsemen who were present. And then 5 days later in Mackay, the popularity of Professor Kemp's buck jumping exhibitions appears to be increasing. On Saturday evening and last night, the spacious tent was well filled. Among other novelties introduced on Saturday evening was Miss Kemp, who amidst tremendous applause rode a bucking bull twice around the ring. Unable to dislodge its rider, the beast threw itself down, but the agile rider was on her feet and away long before the infuriated animal regained its feet. And on the 25th of January 1906, in the Ipswich Herald and General Advertiser, Professor Kemp has accepted Professor Screwthorpe's challenge to bridle, saddle and ride Rebel, and this feat will be essayed tomorrow night. It is understood that Professor Kemp's sister will undertake to ride the Blue Bullock on the same evening. So in the Brisbane Truth, 3 days later, Screwthorpe versus Kemp. A bumper house witnessed the commencement of Professors Screwthorpe and Kemp's buck jumping and horse handling competition. Miss Kemp undertook to ride Screwthorpe's black-polled Angus heifer, and right well she did it too, in a man's saddle. The heifer gave her a rough time, but Miss Kemp never showed a sign of shifting, riding with her hands above her head. Kemp on Calliope, Screwthorpe on Wild Rose, both gave magnificent exhibitions, the former riding with his hands in the air, the latter without stirrups. At the conclusion of his turn, Kemp announced that he would allow his arms to be tied behind his back and would ride against Screwthorpe. Altogether the show is a capital one. And then on the 2nd of February 1906 in the Brisbane Courier it announces the last evening's performance of horsemanship display. Professor Screwthorpe and Kemp's buck jumping competition drew a good house last evening, and the exhibition contained many novel items. Miss Kemp rode Gentle Annie, a fiery buck jumper, which vainly endeavoured to unseat its rider. As an additional example of her skill, Miss Kemp had the bridle removed and then rode the mare to a standstill. Professor Kemp rode Wonder and gave a splendid exhibition. Winterbottom's outlaw, an animal that a week ago was considered unconquerable, was allotted to Professor Kemp, who rode him with only a surcingle as an aid. The horse at once admitted itself mastered, and Miss Kemp is announced to ride it round town today as a hack. Professor Kemp handled a colt and gave his audience many useful hints on the way to treat their steeds. A different system to that of Professor Kemp was adopted by Professor Screwthorpe, but he too had much that was valuable to impart on his demonstration. Then a little less than 2 weeks later, in the Warwick Examiner and Times, it says there's numerous sideshows on the grounds and will include the chief attraction of Professor Kemp's buck jumping exposition. This show has just completed a very successful season in the Westmoreton districts, and the exhibition of riding by the Professor, his daughter, and staff is well worth witnessing. They anticipate doing good business. On the 31st of March 1906, they're in New South Wales, and the Manila Express announced that Professor Kemp, the renowned horseman, will open in Manila with his great buck-jumping circus. According to all the press reports we've seen, the Professor himself is nothing short of a marvel at handling horses, and does things with an unbroken colt that must be seen to be believed. The Tamworth News says that some men are marvellously good at handling horses, and Professor Kemp is a king amongst such men. And the greatest of all lady riders, Miss Kemp. Miss Kemp, who rode the notorious outlaw Scorpion to a finish in Tamworth, will on Saturday night have the mount on a very bad local buck jumper, as well as riding the bucking bullock. Miss May Bryant, the champion lady ball puncher, will give a display of this fascinating exercise, whilst Pedro the Clown and a laughter-provoking dummy all tend to make up what should be a capital night's amusement. On the 23rd of March 1906, in the Tenterfield Intercolonial Courier and Fairfield and Wallingarra Advocate, Walter Gerald Kemp pled guilty to riotous behaviour on the showground on the 9th of March. Mr Harris, solicitor, appeared for the accused and stated that there were mitigating circumstances in this case, as the people had been annoying the professor by looking into his tent without paying for the privilege to do so. Kemp was annoyed and spoke about the matter, and his wife then came out. Some person insulted her, and then Kemp shoved the man away. Sergeant Ether told that Kemp was fighting with a man named Armstrong. He was not aware as to what led up to the row, but when Kemp was asked, he stopped fighting. Under these circumstances, as explained by the sergeant, Mr Harris asked for a nominal fine, and the magistrate fined him 5 shillings and 3 shillings 6 costs of court, or 24 hours imprisonment. The fine was paid. Then they're in Glen Innes, and the only reason why I know they're in Glen Innes is on the 7th of April 1906, Walter Gerald Kemp, better known as Professor Kemp, featured in the Glen Innes Police Court. He was summoned by Finlay Macpherson for assault. The defendant did not appear, but was represented by Mr Harrison of Tenterfield. The evidence of complainant and James McIntyre showed that Kemp and Macpherson went into McIntyre's auction mart to make terms for a rough riding contest. An argument occurred and Kemp banged Macpherson 3 times in the eye and face, inflicting a cut and a black eye. The police magistrate directed the defendant to pay a fine of £1, with the court costs of 8 shillings, professional costs of £1 1 shilling, and the witnesses' expenses of £1 and 10 shillings. In default, 21 days hard labour in the Glen Innes jail. On the 6th of May 1906 in the Brisbane Truth, it reported an incident that was originally published in the Sydney Truth. Easter brings to Sydney many queer people, but surely Easter 1906 has in one way put up a record. Among the visitors were Walter Kemp, a rough rider who came to compete and exhibit feats of horsemanship at Scunthorpe's buck jumping exhibition at the show, and his wife Mary. On Saturday evening, April the 21st, the pair, who occupied a room in Margaret Street, began to do things, with the consequence that at the Water Police Court on Monday they were charged, Walter with having unlawfully assaulted Ellen Grant, Alan Barr, and Constable Louis Lockhart, and Mary with unlawfully assaulting Constable David Houston and Joseph Grant. Walter Kemp, a tously-haired man of fierce aspect, whose face bore long scratches down his forehead, nose and cheeks, looked almost anything but what he described himself as, to wit, a horsebreaker 35 of Queensland. He both looked and spoke like an Englishman and was dressed somewhat eccentrically. Mrs. Kemp is a slim, dark young woman with a permanent frown and a determined expression. The evidence went to show that Kemp had undertaken to clean out Margaret Street, and that things must have been very lively down there about 7 p.m. on Saturday. Grant and Barr were joint proprietors of a coffee palace at the location mentioned, and about 7 p.m. on Saturday week, they and Mrs. Grant heard screams of "Murder! Help! Oh, Walter, have mercy on me!" proceeding from the room occupied by the Kemps. Mrs. Grant ran to the door and implored Kemp not to hurt his wife. She found him, she swore, kneeling on his wife's body, as he lay on her back on the floor. He let her up and she rushed out of the room, and Kemp rushed at Mrs. Grant, took her by the throat and struck her heavily on the forehead. She showed the scar on her brow and the discoloration of her throat to Mr. Wilshire, the magistrate. She fell from the blow and while on the floor saw Kemp striking and kicking her husband, and Mrs. Kemp wielding a horsewhip over her husband. She also struck Mr. Grant in the face. The police came and tried to quieten the man, but he took to them and fought like a wild beast, while his wife beat Constable Houston over the head with a whip. Barr bled freely from his wounds and had to go to hospital. Joseph Grant corroborated his wife's statement, and besides telling of the smashing he got on his own account, bore testimony as to the fact that after Barr was on the ground, Kemp kicked him repeatedly on the face and body. Alan Barr told how he saw Mr. and Mrs. Grant flying back under Kemp's assault and going to the rescue. He closed with Kemp, who at once threw him and started to kick him. He also got hold of his lip and tore it. The accused was quite sober. He kicked witness in the head, and the wound, and that in his mouth, bled freely, so that he had to go to the hospital to have it stitched. While struggling with Kemp, Mrs. Kemp came and struck the witness with a whip. When the police came, the accused was ungovernable and hit Lockhart on the arm, and the woman walloped Houston over the head with her riding whip. Constable Louis Lockhart stated that he was called to the restaurant at 7 p.m. He found Kemp very wild and violent, advised him to be quiet and peaceable and to come quietly. But the man went on something terrible, and when he and Houston, who came to his assistance, endeavoured to put the handcuffs on him, he fought fiercely and bit the witness on the upper arm. Here the accused asked witness if he was willing to show the marks of teeth to the doctor with a view to proving that they were not done by his mouth, but by his wife's, which was of quite another shape. Constable David Houston corroborated that when he went in, Mrs. Grant gave the accused, Walter Kemp, into custody for assaulting her. Barr was bleeding badly from the mouth and forehead, and Kemp fought like a madman, and Mrs. Kemp screamed, "You shan't take him," and hit the witness over the head with a riding whip, raising the bumps produced. He heard Lockhart sing out that he was bitten, and at that time Mrs. Kemp was not in a position to have bitten him, as he and the male accused were in holds on the floor. Both accused went into the box. Both swore that they'd never had a quarrel together in their lives. The husband said his wife wanted him to take her to the circus, but he wanted to go to see the living pictures. She refused to let him go without her, and she put her back to the door, and when the crowd came and broke in the door, she was shoved to the floor, and he was kneeling over her to raise her when people rushed in. Barr, who was truculent, said he could beat witness, and struck Mrs. Kemp, and he accused then struck Barr. Then he was struck from behind, and about 4 men got a hold of him, and they all fell together. The witness went on to say that he did not bite Lockhart, nor did he kick Barr. He was double-balked and fought for his own safety. To Mr. Smith, he said he had never been convicted of any offence, but subsequently admitted that he had been fined in Brisbane for cruelty to animals, though he protested that the horse had been injured while being ridden by Mrs. Kemp by collision with a cab. He accounted for the scars on his face by saying that crockeryware was thrown by the woman in the row and that he stopped some of it with his features. He'd never quarrelled with his wife, and she had not been screaming for an hour before Mrs. Grant came into the room. As a matter of fact, they were the happiest couple in Australia. He got hit on the head and did not come to his senses till he found himself in the station. He stood there, a mere bag of bones and muscles. His hair, which he endeavoured to wear a la cowboy, was a mere scraggy straggle of unkempt, no pun intended, locks that suggested the need of a barber's scissors and a hot shampoo. His face was narrow, with the shifty black eyes close together beneath the shadow of a high bony nose. He had buck teeth, yellow and gapped, and his moustache was like a few hog bristles stuck haphazard in a lump of dingy clay. His shoulders sloped like a lemonade bottle, and his clothes fit him too quick all over. His voice was a high rasp, running into a nerve-wracking falsetto, and he was altogether a vision that made a lot of people ask, "Who's the rummy guy?" He stood 5 foot 11 inches. Mary Kemp corroborated. When the woman came to her door, she told her to go away and not interfere. She had not called murder, nor was there any reason to. In reply to Mr. Smith, she admitted she had struck a man at the showgrounds across the face with the same whip that she used on Constable Houston. Mr. Wilshire convicted both, and for the assaults on Grant and Barr, £4 in each case, with £1 1 costs or 6 weeks hard labour, and in the Lockhart case, they were fined £2 with 2 weeks alternative. Mary Kemp was fined £2 or 2 weeks on each charge, with a guinea cost in the Grant case. Kemp asked for time to pay the £17 3 but a friend in court got up and offered to put it down on the nail. In part 2, I'll be covering how John Patrick Daly continues his buck jumping show, and also you would have noticed that the misdemeanours, although quite small, are starting to increase in number. So does this mean that we're going to be getting to a higher level of criminality? Well, you'll find out in part 2.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.